I remember exactly where I was when my world tilted sideways. It was a Saturday night, late, about 8 p.m., and I was sitting in my car outside a grocery store in a quiet part of Colorado. My phone buzzed, an email notification. It was the lab. 2 weeks of hell, of not sleeping, of my mind racing with every possible scenario, and now the results were here. I clicked open the attachment, my thumb trembling, and the first line hit me like a physical blow, 0% probability of paternity. The words just hung there. 0. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. I reread it, then reread it again, as if there was some fine print I was missing, some hidden clause that would explain how the last 9 years of my life hadn't just evaporated. I sat there for over an hour, watching people go in and out, their carts full of mundane Saturday night things, and I couldn't move. Because moving meant accepting it. And the weirdest thing? I wasn't angry. Not at first. I just felt stupid. Like the biggest fool alive. Like everyone else had known this secret all along, and they'd been laughing behind my back for a decade. Every birthday party I'd shown up to with gifts, every school pickup where I'd rearranged my work schedule, every night I'd gone to bed exhausted from being a dad. None of it had been real. Not in the way I thought it was. But to really understand how I ended up in that parking lot, staring at those words, we have to go back. Way back. For 9 years, I wired money to Melissa every single month, like clockwork. Never missed a payment. I showed up for Leo's birthday parties, even when his mom, my ex-wife Melissa, made it clear I wasn't welcome. I picked him up from school when she had other priorities. And I never, not once, complained about a system that left me eating ramen 4 nights a week while she seemed to live comfortably in a house I helped fund. I wasn't Father of the Year, I'll admit it. But I was there. I was consistent. And I never made Leo feel like a burden. Melissa made sure everyone knew I was the bad guy in our divorce. The man who abandoned his family. What she conveniently forgot to mention were the 3 incidents I discovered during our marriage, or the financial chaos she created, or the way she'd disappear for weekends and return smelling like someone else's cologne. I didn't fight her in court because I wanted Leo to have stability. I didn't argue when she got primary custody because I believed a kid needed his mom. And I didn't push back when the judge set child support at a number that financially crippled me. I just paid. I kept my head down. I tried to be the dad Leo deserved, even though his mother made it clear I'd never be enough. Then last month, her lawyer sent me a letter demanding a 30% increase in child support. Not a small adjustment, but a massive jump. The reasoning? Inflation, rising costs, and the fact that my salary had grown. I'm a financial manager. I work long hours. I've been promoted twice in 5 years. Yeah, I make more now, but I'm still in a 1-bedroom apartment, still driving a car with 160,000 miles on it. Half my paycheck disappears on the 1st of every month. Melissa, on the other hand, hadn't held a steady job in 3 years. She'd post online about spa days and weekend getaways. Every time I picked up Leo, he'd be wearing worn-out shoes while she carried a new handbag. The money I sent wasn't going where it was supposed to. When her lawyer started throwing around phrases like financial responsibility and the child's needs, something inside me just snapped. I didn't hire a lawyer immediately. I just asked for an audit. A simple breakdown of where the money was going, receipts for Leo's expenses, proof the increase was necessary. You'd think I'd asked her to commit a crime. Melissa blew up my phone, calling me controlling, accusing me of punishing her, saying I was weaponizing money to hurt Leo. When I didn't back down, she started posting vague messages on social media about deadbeat dads. My phone lit up with messages from mutual friends, coworkers. She was building a narrative where I was the villain, and she was the victim. I wanted to scream, to post my own side of the story, but I didn't. I knew it would make things worse. So, I stayed quiet, letting her control the conversation while I figured out my next move. When someone gets that defensive over a simple request for transparency, what are they really protecting? We had a meeting in a coffee shop. I brought a folder, 9 years of payment records, every bank statement, every receipt. Proof I'd never been late, never negligent. I slid it across the table and told her I just wanted transparency. She looked at me like I'd spit in her face. She didn't open the folder. She didn't even glance at it. She just stared at me, cold, and said I'd always been like this, always needing to be right, always needing to control everything. My hands shook under the table. I wasn't angry yet. I was just exhausted. Tired of being the bad guy. Tired of paying for a life I wasn't part of. And that's when I said it. The thing I'd been holding back for almost a decade. The question that had been lurking in the back of my mind since the day I found out about her first affair. After everything you did during our marriage, after all the lies, I think I deserve to know the truth, I said. She went completely still. I need a DNA test. The words came out quieter than I expected, but they landed like a bomb. For a second, Melissa just stared at me blankly. Then she laughed. Not a real laugh, but this sharp, bitter sound. She asked if I was seriously going to punish our son because I couldn't let go of the past. I told her I wasn't punishing anyone. I just wanted to know. She stood up so fast her chair scraped across the floor. "You're a monster," she screamed, loud enough for the entire coffee shop to hear. Then she walked out, leaving me sitting there with my folder of useless receipts and a question I couldn't take back. I didn't hear from her for 3 days. When she finally responded, it was through her lawyer, a formal letter agreeing to the DNA test, but only if I continued paying child support during the process and covered all associated costs. I agreed. I didn't have a choice. And part of me, the part that had been there for every scraped knee and bedtime story, truly believed the test would come back positive, and this whole nightmare would be over. I scheduled the test. Melissa brought Leo in without saying a word to me. I watched my son swab the inside of his cheek while his mother stood in the corner, arms crossed, glaring at me like I was destroying his life. Leo didn't understand. He just knew his dad was being weird. When the nurse handed me my own swab, I felt like the worst person in the world. During those 2 weeks waiting for the results, I told myself it didn't matter what the test said. That I'd still be Leo's dad. That biology wasn't everything. But deep down, I knew if it came back negative, everything would change. And then, that Saturday night in the grocery store parking lot, it did. Everything changed. I didn't tell anyone for 3 days. I went to work, sat through meetings, answered emails, pretending everything was fine while my brain replayed every memory of Leo as a baby, searching for signs I'd missed. I started seeing things that weren't there. Or maybe they'd always been there, and I just ignored them. How Leo had her eyes and her laugh, but nothing that looked like me. How during the pregnancy, Melissa had been strange about doctor's appointments, always going alone, always brushing off my questions. On Wednesday night, I called my brother. I told him everything. He was silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was shaking. He asked what I was planning to do. I realized I had no idea. Melissa didn't reach out after the test. Not a text, not a call, nothing. And that told me everything. She'd known. Maybe not for certain, but she'd known it was possible. And she'd spent 9 years betting I'd never ask. That I'd just keep paying, keep playing dad, and never question the story she'd sold me. On Friday, I got an email from her lawyer. Not about the test results, but about the child support increase. Like nothing had changed. Like the DNA test was just a minor inconvenience. The email talked about setting aside our differences for Leo's sake and doing the right thing. I almost threw my laptop across the room. I forwarded it to a family lawyer I'd found online, a woman named Sarah, who had excellent reviews. I scheduled a consultation for Monday morning. Sarah looked at the DNA results for maybe 10 seconds before looking up at me. She laid out my options: petition to terminate child support, sue for repayment of what I'd already paid, fight for custody if I wanted to maintain a relationship with Leo despite biology, or walk away completely. I told her I didn't want to hurt Leo. He didn't ask for any of this. She nodded like she'd heard it 1,000 times and explained that I needed to think about myself, too. Melissa wasn't going to stop demanding money just because the truth was out. I signed the paperwork that day, a petition to terminate child support and a request for an emergency hearing. Sarah said she'd file everything by the end of business. That's when Melissa started her campaign. A calculated, vicious campaign designed to destroy me before I could destroy her. She posted on every social media platform she had. Long, emotional posts about how I was abandoning a child I'd raised for 9 years, how I was using DNA as an excuse to escape my responsibilities, how I was traumatizing Leo by rejecting him over something he couldn't control. She didn't mention the incidents. She didn't mention the lies. She just painted herself as a struggling single mom and me as a monster who decided biology mattered more than love. My phone exploded. People I barely knew told me I was disgusting. Coworkers asked if the rumors were true. Even my own mother called, asking what I was thinking. I wanted to fight back, to post the DNA results, the affair timeline, every piece of evidence that showed who Melissa really was. But Sarah told me not to. Anything I said publicly could be used against me in court. So, I just watched my reputation burn while Melissa played the victim. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out. And in that time, Melissa did something I didn't expect. She named the biological father, a guy named Daniel, who'd worked with her at an insurance company back when Leo was conceived. She did it through her lawyer, in a formal statement that basically threw him under the bus while trying to keep my wallet open. I'd never heard of Daniel. Didn't know what he looked like or if he even knew Leo existed. But apparently, Melissa had kept in touch with him. Now she was dragging him into this mess, too. Sarah called and told me things just got more complicated. Now there were 3 parties: me trying to get out, Melissa trying to keep the money flowing, and Daniel, who might not even know he had a kid. I looked Daniel up on social media. Found his profile in about 5 minutes. I spent an hour scrolling through photos of his life. He was married, had 2 kids of his own, worked as a sales manager, looked happy in that basic suburban dad way. I wondered if he had any idea what was coming. Part of me wanted to message him, warn him, tell him Melissa was about to blow up his life the same way she'd blown up mine. But I didn't. Sarah had made it clear I shouldn't contact anyone involved in the case. 2 days later, Daniel's lawyer filed a motion demanding his own DNA test. Which meant he either didn't know or didn't believe Melissa. Suddenly, there were 2 legal battles happening at once. Me trying to get out, and Daniel trying to figure out if he was in. The worst part wasn't the court dates or the lawyers or the money I was spending. The worst part was Leo. Melissa had told him some version of the story. I don't know what exactly, but when I showed up for my next scheduled visitation, he looked at me differently, like I was a stranger. He barely talked, just sat on my couch playing games on his tablet. When I tried to explain that I still cared about him, that none of this was his fault, he just shrugged and said his mom told him I didn't want to be his dad anymore. I didn't know how to respond to that. Didn't know how to tell a 9-year-old his mom had lied about everything. So I just told him that wasn't true and left it at that. But I could see he didn't believe me. Sarah filed the lawsuit the following week, not just against Melissa, but a formal petition for fraud and repayment of child support. She warned me it was going to get ugly. She said Melissa would fight back, use every trick in the book. And she was right. 2 days after the filing, Melissa's lawyer submitted evidence that I'd allegedly known about her affair with Daniel during the marriage and had accepted Leo as mine anyway. The evidence was a series of text messages between me and Melissa from years ago. Messages where I'd said things about wanting us to work, about believing Leo needed both of us. They were twisting my words to make it sound like I'd known all along and waived my right to contest paternity. I read through those old messages and felt sick because they were real. I had said those things. But not because I knew Leo wasn't mine. I'd said them because I was trying to save a marriage that was already dead. The hearing was scheduled for early November. 2 separate cases now running parallel, mine against Melissa, and the state's case to establish Daniel as the legal father. Sarah said, depending on how things went, this could drag on for months, even years. I asked her what my chances were, and she gave me this look that told me she'd seen cases like mine go both ways. She explained it really depended on the judge. Some saw this as clear fraud, while others saw it as a man trying to escape responsibility. We needed to be prepared for anything. I went home that night and sat in my apartment, staring at the wall, thinking about how I'd spent 9 years building a life that wasn't real, and how the only way forward was to tear it all down. Melissa called me directly for the first time in weeks, using a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, she asked if I was really going to destroy everything. I told her she'd already done that. She hung up. The first hearing happened on a cold morning in early November. One of those days where the sky is gray and everything feels heavy. I sat in that courtroom watching Melissa's lawyer paint me as a man who'd raised a child for 9 years and was now abandoning him over a piece of paper. They had photos of me and Leo at birthday parties, screenshots of text messages where I'd called him my son, even a Father's Day card he'd made me in 2nd grade. They displayed it all like evidence of some contract I'd signed in blood. Melissa sat at her table, looking devastated, dabbing her eyes with tissues, playing the part of the heartbroken mother protecting her child from a monster. I wanted to stand up and scream that she'd lied about everything, but Sarah squeezed my arm and whispered that I needed to stay calm. The judge, an older woman named Judge Ramirez, who looked like she'd seen every trick in the book, listened to both sides without much expression. When Melissa's lawyer finished his performance about emotional bonds over biology, Judge Ramirez asked one simple question that cut through all the noise. She asked if Melissa had known or suspected during the marriage that the child might not be mine. Melissa's lawyer stumbled over his words, trying to avoid a direct answer, talking about the complexities of relationships and the fog of memory. I watched Judge Ramirez's expression shift from neutral to skeptical in about 5 seconds. Sarah stood up and presented the DNA results, the timeline of Melissa's affair with Daniel, and the fact that Melissa had never once suggested a paternity test herself, despite knowing about the affair, despite having every opportunity to come clean during the divorce proceedings 9 years ago. She brought up the child support modification request that had triggered this whole mess, pointed out that Melissa had demanded more money while simultaneously hiding information that would have made me not legally responsible for any payments at all. She argued that this was textbook fraud. Melissa's lawyer tried to redirect, claimed that I'd implicitly accepted paternity by being involved in Leo's life. But Sarah was ready with case law showing that fraud undermines everything, that you can't enforce a contract or obligation based on a lie. Judge Ramirez called for a recess and said she'd issue a ruling within 2 weeks. As I walked out of that courtroom, Melissa tried to approach me in the hallway, but her lawyer pulled her back. I just kept walking. I didn't hear anything for 10 days. During that time, I lived in this weird limbo, not knowing if I was still Leo's father in the eyes of the law, or if I was about to be released from a 9-year sentence I'd never deserved. I kept going to work, kept paying my bills, kept checking my email obsessively. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon, Sarah called and told me to sit down. Judge Ramirez had ruled in my favor. She terminated my child support obligation, effective in 30 days pending any appeals, and ordered Melissa to provide full financial documentation for a separate hearing about repayment of past support. Sarah said it was a significant win. Judges rarely went this far in paternity fraud cases. But the fight wasn't over. Melissa could appeal, and the repayment case was going to be brutal. I asked what happened with Daniel, and Sarah said his DNA test had come back positive. He was Leo's biological father, and the state was now pursuing him for future child support while my case against Melissa for repayment moved forward separately. That's when Melissa made her biggest mistake. The kind of mistake that turns a legal case into a criminal investigation. About a month after the ruling, I got a notification from my bank about unusual activity on an old joint account I'd set up during our marriage for emergencies. One that was supposed to have been closed during the divorce, but had somehow slipped through the cracks. Someone had charged $8,000 to it over the course of 3 days. When I called the bank, they told me the charges were for cash advances and transfers. I immediately thought of Melissa. I pulled up the account history online and saw she'd been using it sporadically for months, small charges here and there that I'd never noticed. But now she'd gone big, probably panicking about losing child support and thinking she could grab whatever she could before everything crashed down. I reported it to the bank, filed a fraud claim, and called Sarah, who told me this was potentially identity theft and that I should file a police report immediately. I went down to the station and gave them everything, the account statements, the timeline, proof that I'd never authorized the charges. The officer taking my report looked at me with this mix of pity and disbelief. Over the next month, the bank's fraud department confirmed that the signatures on the cash advance slips didn't match mine, that the IP address for the online transfers traced back to Melissa S. apartment, and that they were referring the case for prosecution. Sarah called me and said Melissa had just made my repayment case 10 times easier. Now it wasn't just about child support fraud. It was about financial fraud, forgery, and theft. The final hearing was scheduled for mid-December. By that point, Melissa S.'s world was falling apart in real time. She'd lost her part-time job after the fraud investigation became public. Daniel S.'s wife had filed for divorce after finding out about Leo, and the legal system was now pursuing Daniel for child support while simultaneously investigating Melissa for multiple counts of fraud. I showed up to court with Sarah, and Melissa showed up with a public defender because her original lawyer had dropped her. She looked completely different from the confident woman who'd demanded more money just 7 months earlier. Judge Ramirez reviewed everything: the original paternity fraud, the account theft, the forged documents, and the pattern of deception that had gone on for nearly a decade. When Melissa S.'s public defender tried to argue she'd been acting out of desperation as a single mother, Judge Ramirez cut him off and said, "Desperation doesn't justify fraud." The ruling came down hard. Melissa was ordered to repay $60,000 in child support I'd paid over 9 years. She was placed on probation for the financial fraud, and she lost primary custody of Leo pending a full evaluation. The judge said Leo would be placed temporarily with Melissa S.'s parents under court supervision while custody arrangements between Melissa and Daniel were being determined. And that I would have the option to pursue visitation if I wanted to maintain a relationship with the child I'd raised. I sat there listening to all of this and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no victory. Just this overwhelming exhaustion that comes from watching something you built get demolished piece by piece. Melissa looked at me as they read the custody decision, and her face was blank, like she'd finally run out of performances. I wondered if she'd ever actually cared about Leo, or if he'd just been a paycheck to her all along. I walked out of that courthouse in mid-December with the winter air biting at my face. Sarah told me the repayment would probably take years, that Melissa would likely declare bankruptcy, that I'd probably never see most of that money. But at least the truth was finally on record. I thanked her, paid her final invoice, and drove home to my 1-bedroom apartment, where I'd been living like a broke college student for 9 years while funding someone else's lie. That night, I sat on my couch and thought about Leo. About whether I should pursue visitation, about whether it would hurt him more or help him to have me in his life after everything that had happened. I realized I didn't have an answer. I didn't destroy my son's life. I stopped letting a lie fund itself. And if that makes me a monster in some people's eyes, I can live with that. Leo is in therapy now. Daniel is trying to figure out how to be a father to a 9-year-old he didn't know existed. And Melissa is living with her parents while she deals with probation and bankruptcy. I loved a child who wasn't mine by blood. I showed up for him when I thought he was mine. I did everything a father is supposed to do. What broke everything wasn't the DNA. It was the moment she demanded more money and thought the truth wouldn't matter. This whole experience taught me something profound about deception. It's never just one lie. It's a cascading system that requires constant maintenance and escalating risks. Melissa's initial fraud might have remained hidden indefinitely if she hadn't gotten greedy. The real tragedy here isn't the legal outcome. It's that a child's entire foundation was built on dishonesty. What do you think about this?